So welcome to DisruptED TV. I am Michele Hill and the host of Teacher Sparks. And today I'm joined by Jay Armstrong from Robbinsville, New Jersey. Hi, Jay.
Hey, how you doing, Michele?
I'm great. Jay is someone that I've followed for a long time on Twitter, and it prompted me to want to have him here because he is an awesome writer, blogger, and he has a blog called Write On, Fight On. He talks about the importance and of telling your story. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Jay.
Yeah, sure. I've been a teacher for 15 years, secondary teacher. I currently teach 4 classes of AP Literature and 1 class of creative writing. I've been teaching AP Literature for 12 years now. So that's kind of like my main focus. However, when teaching, let's say AP Lit, I always like to infuse storytelling because I think storytelling is so fundamental to reaching your students. It lays the foundation of the class. It creates a sort of atmosphere that, quite frankly, I don't think you can replicate because storytelling is about living. And as the giver of grades, students often don't see you as a living being. And I think it's really important to establish your humanity in the class.
I agree. It's one of those things that I have always talked about. You know, students see us almost like as superheroes sometimes, or just, you know, these other superficial beings that they wonder, you know, do you really eat or do you wear sweatpants or,
right.
or do nuns wear underwear? You know, that kind of crazy stuff, but
Absolutely.
They do see you so differently. So I love the fact that you talk about writing and how important it is. And I want to, you know, go back to the teacher in the classroom. What advice would you give a teacher in the classroom of why it's important to write, whether they decide to use it, you know, to publish it or just to keep it for themselves? What are the benefits to writing their own story?
You know, I didn't learn how to teach writing until I started writing myself. And I'll openly admit that. I struggled teaching writing probably for about 7 years. It was really hard for me. I mean, teaching writing is really difficult. And learning to write myself made me a much better teacher because in a way I knew the struggles they were going through. I sort of understand, you know, I do understand the writer's mindset. And so as a teacher, it's so incredibly valuable to work on the craft because you don't understand the craft until you actually do it. And if you just recite definitions or instructions from something that you read, it's not going to connect. So by infusing yourself into the writing process, you just become a better writing teacher.
Well, how about for those teachers that aren't writing teachers? Maybe they're teaching science or math. Do you see any benefits that they would have maybe personally for writing?
Well, I think what writing does, no matter what the subject is it puts a magnifying glass to the subject. And you really get to look at the subject up close and personal. And again, for me, teaching English, I learned so much about not only writing, but reading through writing. And so writing is just a way to develop critical thinking skills. It's putting that magnifying glass up to the subject. And as a teacher, you have to be developing your critical thinking skills. I mean, that's what you're trying to get your students to do. You have to practice it.
And off camera, I told you that I find it to be very cathartic because when I'm frustrated about something that I may not agree with or that I see could be improved, the first thing I want to do is run and write an article about how it could be improved or how we could come together and make it better. And what always surprised me is that other people were willing to read it and then also, you know, kind of chime in there like, yeah, I felt exactly the same way. So that always validated my viewpoint. So whether or not you're a writing teacher, English teacher, or any subject, I think that we all have a commonality of education and that we can all share our experiences about education through writing. So I think that that's really valuable.
Right.
Now, I want to ask about your students because I know that you teach writing and you also have your blog. And sometimes you call for submissions. Can you tell us about what that is?
Yeah, so, you know, I don't really write about education. I write about, I guess, life and the experiences that I have. And the things I write about, I guess for some people it would be tough to write about. I show no, I guess fear. When I write about my own personal life, I try to write honestly, and I try to write authentically, and I try to show vulnerability. And what I realize is that students respond to that, especially high school kids, because they're all trying to be invulnerable. And then I think when they have an adult who comes along and says things honestly and truthfully, it really, really impacts them and encourages them. If I can just tell a brief story here. A few years ago, our superintendent of our district, Dr. Stephen Mayer, passed away tragically. And I'll never forget the first day back from school. We were off for 2 days for his death. And I came back into the classroom, and it was a senior class, and it was, people were crying. It was really, really sad, really difficult. And I remember that we got an email about that contained a script for us to read. Because, a lot of teachers didn't know how to begin the day. What do you say? How do you begin? And I read through the script, and it was very artfully written, but I just felt like the script wasn't me. So I told a story, and that's all I did. And I just told the story of this one interaction that Dr. Mayer and I had. And at one point in the story, I broke down and I cried. And I think that validated for a lot of people in the class that it's okay to cry and it's okay to show emotion, because it was one big cry fest in my classroom. And one of the boys who was quiet kid, he sat in the back, he actually stood up and he walked to the front of the class, and everybody was just kind of holding their breath, myself included, and he just gave me a hug in front of the whole class. And I think the idea of storytelling from a teacher's standpoint, from an adult standpoint, is that students don't hear enough stories. They just simply don't. And as I was saying to you earlier, before we went on camera, that storytelling creates a mythology in the class. And I think that's so really important. If you look at any sort of culture, every culture has a mythology, and a classroom is a culture. And if you start telling your stories, you're building this mythology, and you allow other students to partake in that. And you have to encourage that, and you have to lead by example. So I lead by example through my blog. I share things that I've written with my students. It was really scary at first to do that. It really is. But I think by doing that, it created this classroom culture that it's just a great culture to have. Kids come in, I think they feel welcome, and they're not afraid to tell their story. So on my website, I have a call for. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, for me, it's fundamentally at my core that it all begins with that relationship, and you can't build relationships without a conversation or without sharing your stories and being vulnerable. And the best teachers, and especially, I would like to kind of talk to our young teachers or beginning teachers, as you say, not all teachers are young that are beginning, but people who are just stepping into the classroom, is how important it is to create that culture in your classroom of being seen, being vulnerable, and a family culture. Because when kids feel that and sense that, they buy into everything you do, and they want to do it. They want to be a part of it because you're willing to put yourself out there. And so they may not always love your subject area, but they love coming to your class because of that culture. So that's your legacy. And I think that that's an amazing way to build your culture and, create this legacy, is through storytelling. I think it's awesome.
Right. And you know what, it doesn't necessarily you don't necessarily have to be an English teacher to tell a story. You can be a math or a science teacher, but stories create a sense of community, and kids love a story. And in fact, one of the great And I learned this through trials and errors. But I think one of the great classroom management tips that I could offer is become a storyteller, because students love storytelling. Most of my students binge watch Netflix. They love stories. They're so familiar with it. So in my classroom, I actually have a chair. It's just a little folding chair. It has been dubbed the storytelling chair. And so when I sit down, everybody knows what's about to happen, and they quiet down and they just listen. And oftentimes I don't even say good morning. I just say, last Friday night, my wife and I, and then all of a sudden, I launched into a story, and that has worked tremendously.
Yeah, I agree with you about the classroom management piece, because when they know that what you're going to say is true, it's from the heart, whatever it is. It could be talking about, Sunday dinner. It could be talking about an embarrassing moment in your life, something like that. When that happens, they automatically buy in, and it creates a warmth like no other, and it's a valuable classroom management tool, because you don't have issues and problems with those students.
Right.
So I want to ask you, what opportunities do you give your students to write? Obviously, you're an English teacher, so you give them the normal, traditional writing tasks, but how do you invite them into writing about themselves and being vulnerable and telling their story?
Well, I mean, kids often align writing to grades, and that's not fair. Because when they write for grades, they write from a place of fear. So I try to create a sort of fearless writer. And to do that, I give them personal assignments that require a serious amount of reflection, but I don't grade them. I grade them on just completion. Okay. I have some parameters set up, but I don't go through and I don't check up with a red pen and mark up and say, okay, I'm deducting 5 points for this. I try to give them that open space to write their own story and be creative in their own way. And I've eliminated strict rubrics and grading. And I think by doing that, by giving them that freedom to do that, they're very appreciative, and they take that opportunity to discover themselves and to discover their voice.
That's probably one of my most favorite things that you said today, which is that you remove that whole idea about grading. Yeah. We are so grade driven in education. Everything is about data and grades. And so students will work for a grade as opposed to doing something of good quality work because they want to have pride in it. So what I used to do with students as well is I wouldn't put a grade on it. And I would just, if it was something where I needed to mark the mistakes made, or I would say you could increase your overall grade by doing X, Y, or Z. Some of them would say, please, can't you just accept it just like it is? And I was like, no, because it's just not good quality. But yeah. I think when we take grades out of the evaluation, out of the equation, that what we do is we now give them freedom to explore. Another thing that I like to do is project-based learning, because with that, there's not specific guidelines. I'll say there'll be very loose guidelines, and they'll ask me, well, can I do this? I'm like, sure. And yeah. Like, well, can you tell me how to do it? No, this is for you to learn. And my goal is really to get kids to understand that whatever you do, if you're learning, that's the goal. It's the learning part, not the grade. That's the outcome. And so I love that you give it back to them and say to them, here's what you need to do to really tell your story. And I think, it reminds me a little bit of the Freedom Writers. In the movie The Freedom Writers, when she gives them all a journal and she says, I'm not going to grade these. If you want me to read them, I will, but if not, they'll be locked up in the cabinet. This is just for you. And I think what happens, at least in my experience with writing, is that as you write more, you get better and you get more comfortable, and you improve with your writing skills, but you also start to understand yourself a little bit better because you're putting your thoughts onto paper.
Right.
And that really helps you to understand things. And then you go back and you reread, you can now see, maybe I misunderstood this situation, or maybe I need to clarify that, or maybe I should have done this. So it offers so many different tools and strategies that are successful for students in life, that I think it's just amazing. And that's why I wanted to have you here today.
Thank you. And one thing that I can say is that I found that students respond better to me having a conversation about their writing as opposed to writing a comment on their page. It can just be like, hey, I really love this piece. I love what you did. I love your use of like a simile here. But one suggestion I have is maybe you try this. And that conversation goes so much further. And when I started having these conversations, I felt like there had to be a formality to them. I feel like in education, there's so much formality, and I felt like there had to be a rubric. And then I've learned that there doesn't have to be. And so some of my conversations happen in the hallway or like in passing, like, hey, I read your piece and you know what I really like. And those comments, those authentic conversations go so much further than just marking up, what they wrote and then leaving a comment.
Well, it's the difference of having a conversation with a person face-to-face or text messaging them. It's not always, the intonation's not there. You always don't have an idea as to how someone felt. I would like to offer this strategy if anyone's watching that they're thinking to themselves, but how do you find time for those conversations? So, I love Flipgrid because you can give meaningful feedback to them that way.
Right.
Or now Google has the opportunity that when you're using Google Docs that you can voice record. So there's Screencastify. There's all different ways that you could give feedback to someone verbally without not necessarily sitting face to face with them, which is the optimum way to give feedback. But if time is a restriction and you can't do that, there are ways that you can do that.
Right. Yeah. And what I often do, and I'm a little old school, but I keep a legal tablet on my desk, and I write everything out in shorthand, and I leave like a comment, like one comment per student, like on my desk. And then so when I do see them in class or in passing, I always have my tablet with me, and I can just look at their name real quick and what I wrote just as a refresher. So
that's a great strategy as well. Well, I want to thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you.
It's important work. Teaching today is different than it was many years ago. A lot of our colleagues would like to tell us that, it's not the same, and that, kids are not the same. And I think to myself, no, they're not. None of us are the same, and the world is not the same. But we have to find a way to make it enjoyable for them. We have to find a way to hook them. And telling your story seems to be the way that you hook them, and that it's working for you. So I wanted to share that with other people who might be looking for a different way, or who just stumbling upon the idea of, do I want to blog? Do I want to write for myself? Do I think about submitting it to someplace? And the benefits to just writing for our own purpose.
Right.
Thank you so much for being here today, Jay. And I look forward to staying connected with you on Twitter. And give a shout out if you need anything, just give a holler, and I'll be happy to help.
Great. It was great talking to you, Michele. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much.